lav mic is going on. Please keep it muted. So this is hot right now, but we have it muted on the back of the stage. Can you get that on your belt there? Tuck it back as far as you can. Yep.
Hey, everybody. Get this thing wired. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be here, and I am sensitive to your time, and forgive me in advance for taking so much of it, because I feel it's incumbent upon me to explain a number of issues that I see as interrelated, and to advance a conversation that I think is long overdue in this state about the new normal. If anyone is wondering if climate change is real, come to California and experience what we've had to experience over the course of the last decade or so. As many of you know, since 2000, 15 of the top 20 most catastrophic and destructive wildfires have occurred. Remarkably, 10 since 2015. You don't need to go back much further than 2018, 2017, and 2015 to see a heightened sense of acuity and destruction as it relates to these wildfires. We are in a very precarious state, literally and figuratively. And it requires us to adapt. It requires us to be nimble. It requires us to meet the moment and to meet the challenge. As some of you may recall, I took the oath of office after I took the reins as acting governor, the day after I was elected, and found myself in capacity as the governor-elect. That was the day, you recall, 24 hours after the election night, that I got the call, many of you did as well, about 12 individuals that were killed in Thousand Oaks, California by gunfire. I came to many of you in a press conference, my first as governor-elect, lamenting about that tragedy. Was told seconds before about two fires that I just should be familiar with and aware of, and one in Southern California and another one in Butte County. One of you asked the question, do you know much about what's going on there? I said, we're just learning about it, and we then went on with our lives. The next morning, I signed a declaration of emergency as acting governor when we realized the magnitude of what was occurring, both at the Camp Fire and the Woolsey Fire. This was brought to me in very intense and personal ways. As a consequence, I took that oath of office in January. The day after, I made my way up to Placer County and had my first press conference as governor, where I signed an executive order and announced in advance my intention to substantially increase funding in our efforts to mitigate, our efforts to suppress fires in this state. We actually committed a $415.1 million budget in this space. I made a commitment to every one of you that I would take this issue more seriously than it had been in the past, with a greater sense of urgency. I had requested in that executive order in January, on January 9th, that CAL FIRE put forward immediate strategies, medium-term and long-term strategies to address our fuels management efforts, our vegetation management efforts, and reinvigorate our strategies to focus in a culturally competent way on the most vulnerable communities in California. In February, I also announced a month later that we would redeploy the National Guard from the California border. I requested of our National Guard that 110 of those guardsmen and women would be redeployed to these fire-prone areas and begin the work of preparing for a wildfire season. I, in addition to that, in February, signed legislation, AB 72, that provided $50 million appropriation that was fast-tracked by the legislature just weeks after it was introduced, that allowed for new, more vigorous emergency planning in the state of California. that allowed us to reach out to diverse communities throughout the state in a bottom-up framework to focus on localizing our emergency communication strategies, to work with volunteers, Cal volunteers, and others to make sure that we are prepared and organized in a much more deliberative way than we had been in the past. In March, just last month, I signed another executive order requesting now a declaration of emergency that would allow us to move forward with recommendations that I'd received from CAL FIRE on 35 key projects on fuel management, forest thinning, and preventative strategies to address issues of not just defensible spaces as it relates to homes and property, but also evacuation routes, again with an eye on socioeconomics, looking at demographics, looking at the percentage of seniors that are mobility impaired, looking at the issue of economics and those that have the capacity to actually get in their own vehicle and to escape, those that did not necessarily have benefits of broadband access and technology so they would even have the capacity of being alerted about emergency situations. A hyper-focused prioritization that respectfully had been done broadly in the past, but not as specifically in the past. Those were 3 executive orders, 4 actions within the first 90 days of this administration to step up our game, to lean into this moment, and to meet this moment head on. We are not being passive as it relates to emergency management and emergency preparation. The reason why is reflected in this slide. There's a new reality in this state. We are living in a state, remarkably, where 25 million acres are very vulnerable to very high to extreme fire threat. We have 11 million people in this state that are at risk. 25% of the population in the state of California are in these what we call wildland urban interfaces, the WUI, as some of you often refer to it. 25% of the population, that's a jaw-dropping percentage of Californians, representing 25% of the landmass of this state in vulnerable parts of the state as it relates to the issues of fire. 4.5 million homes in and around these areas. This puts, I hope, the magnitude of this moment into perspective. And so that's why 60 days ago at the State of the State, I made some bold statements about our need to do even more and to prepare not only for this wildfire season, but to make sure we're prepared for subsequent fire seasons. I requested in relationship to this issue and the situational issue that I also inherited during the transition, and that was PG&E's bankruptcy, that we assemble a strike team led by my Chief of Staff, Ann O'Leary, and a cadre of experts working not only within the administration, but also experts that are advising our key legislative leaders, as well as experts that we were able to source from 2 firms, O'Melveny and Guggenheim. O'Melveny, some of you may know, is a group that's well familiar in terms of their work in Puerto Rico related to their bankruptcy, addressing issues, FEMA. They are experts in energy, and they are well attuned with best practices across not only this country, but around the rest of the world. We also got Guggenheim to provide us financial advice to also advise the strike team about approaches and strategies. They were involved in TARP and many other things. The point being, long-windedly, we got 2 of the best firms in the United States of America to advise the strike team. Long-windedly, today, we're introducing to the public and the legislature a document that lays out their recommendations. It's roughly a 60-page document that addresses not only prioritizing these issues related to upcoming fire season, but prioritizing a strategy to meet the moment as it relates to our utilities' role to make sure that they are securing our grid, hardening their resources, participating in a procurement strategy that can meet our long-term goals, our climate goals, and to make sure that they deliver affordable, reliable service to millions and millions of Californians. And so that's the purpose of this presentation. That's the purpose of this press conference, and that's the purpose of the following presentation. I look at this as an outline, as an educational exercise, as a series of priorities and principles that I think all of us in this state need to consider, reflect upon, and debate with a sense of urgency. I'll talk about next steps at the end of the presentation, but I want to focus on 5 critical areas, and I will do it as quickly as I can so I can get to why you came, which is, I imagine, to ask a few questions. Here are the 5 key actions. Number 1, as I was reflecting just a moment ago, we need to prevent and fight catastrophic wildfires. This should be our top priority in this state. I noted a moment ago the budget enhancements and investments, the $415.1 million for fire protection of forest health. 213.6 million of that was specific for fuels reduction. You'll see in that list a series of specific things that we have done in terms of pre-positioning and mutual aid, increasing our investment in equipment, including new money for operating 7 C-130s for suppression purposes, $109 million that was reflected in that budget for dressing. That's part of the 120. The old Huey helicopters being replaced with these new state-of-the-art helicopters that will be outfitted for suppression purposes. There are money for new engines, new firefighters. Many of them were pre-positioned already, incidentally, in and around the floods that we had up in Russian River. And it's a point of pride that there were no headlines related to the work they did, because unlike baseball, in politics, you don't get credit for saves. And I want to credit the extraordinary work of the men and women that are to my right, to your left, for the good work that they did in responding to the floods. It's an example of the kind of work we need to respond to wildfires in the future, and it goes to the details of what's in this budget. In addition to what you see on the screen, we're making investments into finally digitizing our 911 system, which is remarkable. It's still an analog system. We will be enhancing our alert systems. We will be enhancing our emergency notifications, focusing obviously on interoperability and working aggressively on new technologies. We just had a meeting on new satellite access that we have, which will be novel in terms of our approach on early detection this upcoming fire season, LiDAR systems, new data collection, new weather monitoring, new cameras that we're finally putting into these fire-prone areas for earlier detection, better fire modeling, in addition, again, to the suppression strategies, and in addition to the pre-positioning. That's a big part of this year's budget. We also want to culminate a lot of this work in a summit that will happen in early June. This summit, with intention, is in partnership with CSAC and the League of Cities, our counties and our cities. We are bringing, I know this is rote and cliched, and forgive me, the best and the brightest in the emergency space to present best practices, to present the work that's been done, the report that was requested by Mike McGuire that's now made public on alert systems, opting in versus opting out, looking to standardize the different approaches by county and region and locality. We're bringing all of that to bear, bringing everyone around the table and doing something that, frankly, this state has not done in at least, well, to my knowledge, in many, many years, in order, again, to advance and scale some of the solutions that we know exist but are localized and not evenly spread throughout the state. In addition, a big part of that summit is around evacuation planning. And I say evacuation planning because it's not lost on me the lives that were saved in the Camp Fire. As devastating as that Camp Fire was, had we not done the fuels and vegetation management and focus on defensible space, not around homes, but around evacuation corridors, there would have been no capacity for people in camp in Paradise to evacuate towards Chico. Literally saved, arguably, hundreds of lives. These evacuation protocols also need to be a big part of the conversation. In addition, though, obviously, defensible spaces also includes hardening of homes. And in this report, we lay out a lot of specificity and detail about what we mean. That's hardening skylights, that's hardening garages, that's hardening vents, that's also making sure that we have the appropriate materials, roofing materials, and the like. McClatchy, if you're here, thank you. They did a wonderful piece yesterday around the campfire assessing this issue of home hardening. 51% of the homes that were built after 2008 related to the campfire, 51% of them survived the fire. Just 18% of the homes that were built before 2008 survived the wildfire. Unfortunately, just 3% of the homes in Paradise were built after 2008, thus the destruction. But over half survived because of the building codes this state advanced in 2008. Those building codes save not only property, but save lives. The problem is what was pre-built is overwhelming. 90, arguably in the state, 95-ish% of the existing housing stock was pre-built. So you got to get in a retrofit. That comes at a huge cost. We know that. I'm a former mayor of a city well attuned to retrofitting. Issues of earthquake preparedness and safety. The costs of that are high. Obviously, the cost of fireproofing are also high. And so we lay out the need to identify appropriate funding and financing for home hardening as well. In addition, we took on the issue of deprioritizing. I'll say it. We've got to have this debate. Deprioritizing construction in these very high fire danger WUI zones. You have to have an honest conversation about this, and that requires, for me, some consideration for cities in their general plan to update their general plans to include the issue of fire safety, which is not uniformly done, and we think should be done in this state. Second issue, and I want to go quickly to these other issues, self-evident, climate change. I began with that. I'll end with that. And I'll continue to talk about this because we're passionate about it. It's part of the state's DNA. It's part of our pride, and our proud past, extraordinary work the last two administrations have done on climate change. We're leading not just this nation, we're leading the world. And we should, and we must. In the absence of leadership nationally, which is self-evident, California is asserting itself. Here's why. You just look at that chart where we were in the 80s. This is the western United States. You look at that red, it reflects those wildfires. Here's climate change. Here's a world without climate change. Here's the world we're living in. There is no debate. I have no interest in even engaging in the stale rhetoric of those that are in complete denial about the science. And if they need any evidence because they're intellectually incurious, come to California and we will reinforce the obvious. This is not an ideological endeavor. It's a very pragmatic one for Californians. In order for us, though, to do something about this, we need to achieve our audacious goals, and getting to 100% is audacious, and, by the way, achievable. And you see here, we've already achieved our 33% renewable goal for 2020. We achieved that in 2018. A number of you have written about that, 34%. By the way, if you include, this is for folks not familiar with California's rules and regulation as it relates to our RPS, if you include non-carbon sources, it's actually at 55% in 2018. That's if you include nuclear and hydro. That's remarkable. 55% of that energy is now being procured by non-carbon sources. But for the purposes of RPS, it is statutorily at 34%. It suggests, again, that California is delivering on this promise. The Green Real Deal is in the state of California. We don't need any legislative push because we are in the how business. We have been applying the principles of the Green New Deal for decades now. I don't know why people are so hyperbolic about the Green New Deal. And forgive me, Fox News, forgive me for even pointing you out. I watch on a nightly basis the punditry. The economy has grown actually outpaced the United States of America as we've been advancing the principles of the Green Real Deal in the state of California, proving that some of your assertions are just flat out wrong, naively based, or intentionally misleading. I say that because I feel an obligation to say that, because I'm pulling my hair out almost on a nightly basis listening to some of that punditry. I wish they would take a look at the state of California and its efforts. On that issue, I also want to note that this is driving not just broader efforts to decarbonize our economy, but as I said, grow our economy. The venture capital in this state, $22 billion over the last decade, from 2007 to 2017, $70 billion of capital investment in this space, tens of thousands, arguably hundreds of thousands of jobs directly and indirectly. It's the envy of the rest of the nation. We're in the future business. We are not looking in the rearview mirror. We're looking out the windshield at a brighter, low-carbon, green growth future. But we also are looking at the need to address the uncertainty of this future as it relates to the issues of procurement. And forgive me, I will end this section by talking about procurement, knowing full well how enthusiastic each and every one of you are. Talk about that or listen to it. The issue of procurement is important because 2/3 of our current renewable portfolio is intermittent. 2/3. As a consequence, there's some fragmentation as it relates to the ability to keep those lights on that is required to be addressed. And Cal ISO, as you know, is the organization responsible for addressing that. And so we have bridge fuels that are a big part of that portfolio effort, but also we need more transparency. We need more credit-worthy energy service providers. And as a consequence, I think we need to centralize the procurement in this space. And that is another proposal that comes out of this report that I enthusiastically support. We decarbonize, and we're also decentralizing. And in that space, we need to govern, and we need to manage very differently. This is an opportunity. We're leading the way. The rest of the nation will be out here learning best practices, but only if we advance those best practices. This report highlights how to do that. Let me go back and talk about the third item on the list, and that is the fair allocation of wildfire damages. Here's probably the core of this report, and this goes to, if you're interested, some of the controversy in this report, which I know is of interest to folks. If it's not controversial, it's not interesting. So many of you are here for this section, so let's talk about this section. The fair allocation of damages goes to this slide, which is right here. The soaring costs of wildfires, the good old days, and now the new normal. The jaw-dropping costs, you can see the graph here, 20, 25 billion a year in related costs of these wildfires. So who the heck's going to pay for that? You know, everybody wants someone else to pay for it. It's the person behind the curtain who's going to pay for that. And they're satisfied with that, someone else paying for it. I'm of the opinion that in order to maintain safe, reliable, affordable service, utilities, and electricity, to meet our climate goals, to protect the victims of these fires, that we're all in this together, and we all have a role and responsibility to play in terms of being stakeholders in the solution. And we all have a burden and responsibility to assume the costs. That's my humble opinion. It's not because I poll tested that. I'm not naive. I don't need to poll test that. I know it's not a fanciful thing to say that we're all in this together and we all have a role and responsibility to play. It's easier, again, to pass it on to the insurance companies or the victims or the attorneys or the ratepayers or the utilities or Wall Street. But at the end of the day, I would argue, and this report lays out, you cannot do that and effectively achieve all of our collective goals. We all have a responsibility in this effort. Now, 901, SB 901, was an effort last year to try to address the situational challenges of PG&E. And I appreciate that effort, appreciate the leadership of the legislature and Governor Brown. Respectfully, in terms of getting us to the next level, it's inadequate. And I think even its authors would acknowledge that. As important as it was, it's not enough. And so we are now considering a number of concepts to address the issue of allocation. Number one is a bridge fund, liquidity-only fund. That's a bridge fund. And what I mean by a bridge fund is we would modify SB 901, and you would capitalize this fund by multiple ways. Utilities can capitalize the fund, or you can extend a securitization that existed after the power crisis in 2001 and extend that securitization that's due to sunset in 2020 and continue that funding as a way to help capitalize this bridge fund. Again, voluntary contributions that would do this. The reason I call it a bridge fund, not a liquidity-only fund, even though it's a liquidity-only fund, is that it's about timing. It's bridging the timing between cause and the determination of cause and then determination of recovery. And in that delta creates market uncertainty, credit questions, access to capital, anxiety. And in that anxiety, costs are borne by ratepayers, by taxpayers, and as a consequence, we're not able to, with certainty, make these long-term investments. This also needs to be considered with a commensurate reform, and that's public utilities. Reform, the CPUC, also needs to be reformed. I will get to that as my second to last bullet point, but know that each and every one of these attaches to consideration of reforms at the Public Utilities Commission. The number two principle is adopting a fault-based standard. And this is inverse condemnation reform. This is an issue that was brought to light last year in the debates around SB 901, inverse condemnation. Of course, everyone is familiar with. We grow up as young men and women learning about inverse condemnation by the third grade, understanding its nuances and complexities, and all of us are well versed on strict liability. With that, knowing few of us know what the hell this means, I won't spend too much time on it except to say there are people that understand this, and they advise the strike team. They've made recommendations, but one thing they understand about strict liability, you can't just easily reform it. It's not a legislative fiat. It's a constitutional requirement, and as a consequence, you need to change the Constitution, or you can petition the California Supreme Court and file a direct file to the Supreme Court, and potentially, if everything goes perfectly, maybe in 6 months, they can come back with a determination of whether or not you can consider the common enemy clause that we have for floods and waters as an augmentation of sorts to inverse. If I haven't lost you, you absolutely haven't been listening. So in the report, you will see a detailed analysis of this second recommendation, and this one, I can assure you, drives a lot of passion, but so too does the issue of catastrophic wildfire funding. This is a pooled system, arguably a more robust system than a bridge fund. It too can be extended and capitalized through the DWR securitization that is due to expire in 2020. It would require all of the statewide IOUs. This, again, is an issue broadly of addressing the state's procurement and safe and affordable, reliable electricity is an issue for the entire state. So all of the IOUs in the state, this is not just about PG&E, must participate in this, including potentially the municipalities. The folks in the public power space can choose to join this effort. The issue is more complicated in this respect, more money, more complications. The insurers, the attorneys would have to consider participating, just shaving off a little bit in terms of their subrogation claims maybe, shaving off a little bit potentially on some of their remuneration on behalf of the victims. Everybody in this pool swims together in a larger pool, but as a consequence, you have to pull more people along, and it requires a few bank shots in the vernacular of sports that would, I think, be a worthy solution, but also worthy of a deliberative process because it would have to be arguably the most inclusive of solutions for key stakeholders. That represents, again, the three strategies for what we believe are appropriate concepts for the distribution of wildfire costs. Now, let me just briefly go through the final 2 points, and I'll get you out of here within 30 minutes, or at least out of the presentation. That is reforming the PUC. It's just long overdue. With respect, it's not an indictment of any individuals. In fact, we have a current president of the PUC who's been leading the conversation and debate around reform, and I applaud him for that. And why? Well, for obvious reasons. You're living in an environment where we're procuring about 25% of our electricity resources outside of the large IOUs. Interestingly, PUC noted that in the PG&E territory, which is 40% of the territory in the state of California, they're already procuring over 50% of their electricity outside of their IOU. So it's power purchasing agreements, it's all these CCAs, these community choice aggregators, looking at direct access. I can, again, lose some of you on all this, except to say it requires a different governance structure, a different approach. It requires more certainty. It requires access to more expertise. It requires fast-tracking determination. It requires us to reimagine the administrative law process at the PUC and to address the time value of decision-making. That was highlighted with SDGE that had 3 fires in 2007. It took them 7 years to address the claims, and then it took another couple years for the PUC to ultimately adjudicate the claims, and it was not favorable to SDGE, and they lost some, $379 million, PolitiFact me on that, and as a consequence that led to some stress in the markets, some credit questions, and then of course we had the issues around Camp and Woolsey, and then we had the PG&E bankruptcy. All of this happened over the course of just a few months and led us all here together in this room. And so the issue of a more effective PG&E and the changing energy landscape cannot be lost in terms of this conversation. It is incumbent upon us to reform that agency. Finally, you've got to hold PG&E accountable. I've been very vocal about this. I've been candidly very critical. I've been very concerned about their picks on the board of directors. And I just want folks to know that we're watching, that I expect the investors that are involved in PG&E to participate in the solutions, and I expect that PG&E is going to get serious, no longer misdirect, manipulate, mislead the people of this state about their resolve and commitment to address reliability and safety, to get serious about grid enhancements, and hardening their infrastructure and modernizing their strategies. They were convicted of obstruction of justice. I just think that's interesting. I've heard that phrase before. They were fined. They had to do community service, which maybe begs the question, was Mitt Romney right? Corporation doing community service? Don't quote me on that. That was an aside. They haven't been good actors. I know this personally. I was mayor of San Francisco, their headquarters. I'm not here to beat them up, but you know, the state has suffered because of their neglect and their misdirection. Lives have been lost. By the way, 139 lives have been lost in the last 2 years. 2.8 million acres have burned down. Not all those lives are associated with PG&E. And by the way, not all of those lives and acres are associated with the utility. Remember, about 1 out of 10 fires is a utility fire. We had 9,000 fires in 2017, 7,600 in 2018. The percentage didn't change that were utility-based, but the acuity and magnitude of those utility-based fires did. That's the climate we're in. We're in a climate as well where PG&E is not vulnerable. They were downgraded to junk bond status. They went bankrupt. You have 2 other IOUs, because if you're in Southern California saying, wow, thank God we're not part of this conversation. Well, you missed the entire point of the conversation. You are. You are directly part of this conversation, because you've got service area in Southern California, includes 2 of the largest investor-owned utilities, slightly smaller than PG&E, large nonetheless. SDG&E, which is in that San Diego area, which is a credit rating just above junk bod status, one fire away from going into junk bod status. And you have Southern California Edison that's in exactly the same boat. If they get into junk bod status, that impacts their liquidity, impacts their access to capital. As a consequence of that, you pay more for your electricity. Their borrowing costs go up, insurance rates potentially go up, property values as a consequence go down. You can't get insurance in these wild urban land interfaces. That means your value of your property diminishes, your property tax diminishes, your ability to invest in preschool and after-school program diminish. These things are all connected. This is a serious issue. And if nothing else, the purpose of this report is to raise the seriousness of this moment. This vernacular is tough. When you get into direct access and CCAs and PPAs and IOUs, you lose everybody. It's complicated, I get it. I can't just tweet something out and everyone gets it. But we have to get people's attention on this. Everything is impacted when it comes to the issue of keeping the lights on and addressing the new normal, or abnormal as it is, of climate change in this state. And so let me just end with final words, next steps. And that is, we need to present this report not only to you, the public, but to the legislature, as we have, and we've worked very collaboratively with the legislature, and I just want to applaud them and thank them for their incredible partnership throughout this process in the last 90 days. And now I want to ask them for the following. Let's get something big done before recess. Recess for us is July 12th. Interestingly, 90 days from today. We have 90 days, humbly, from my perspective. Now, by the way, that's their clock, their calendar, not mine. I'm not a member of the legislature, but I'm hopeful that they can meet this moment and meet the demand to be bold and resolved to meet this moment head on, and to take a look at not only what they've offered, a number of them have offered ideas around funds and introduced pieces of legislation, but take a look at what we're recommending and the strike team's recommending, and consider advancing some of these principles. We are ready to go. 901 Commission's ready to go to take these recommendations and make them public and continue their public interfacing. That's the next step with this report. They're going to have a public comment period. They will then inform the legislature, inform me, the strike team, and then we will put together a legislative package, hopefully together, and we'll hopefully get something to my desk very, very soon and meet this moment and let folks in Wall Street know we're not screwing around. Let the bond rating folks and S&P and Moody's and Fitch know we're not bystanders. We need to shape the outcome. We need to shape the future. We need to take account and responsibility, take the reins, lean in, make the tough calls, but meet this moment head on and not play small ball, as this is a moment where we'll be remembered, and not very well if we don't meet it. So that's the presentation. Forgive me for extending your time, but now let me make it yours, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can we ask you directly about inverse condemnation, since that's the thing that's out there so much? The report doesn't make a specific recommendation to end it, for example, to reform it. It obviously lays out the option. You personally, do you think inverse condemnation needs to be changed?
So I purposely am not including my personal opinions because I actually want to accomplish something. And I believe it's incumbent upon me to create the conditions where we can actually get something done versus assert a political frame. My point being that I put out these principles in order to engage now in a public process through the 901 Commission, a process that's very important to me because it's a process that convened a legislative and an executive partnership. And it's midway through their work. And they have a statutory timeline that actually works very well with the July 12th deadline. And so I want to introduce this, and I want them to deliberate. And I want to bring those stakeholders together because I recognize, as you recognize, and you wouldn't be asking this question without deep appreciation of the controversies associated with inverse and its reform, the nature of that controversy, and I want to assess all of that and see what's reasonable, what's doable, and see if we can meet them.
Can I follow? Do you see the challenges on both sides? As you know, the utility companies say they can't afford it. The victims say it's a bailout if you change inverse condemnation. Do you see truth on both of those sides? Again, you don't want to take a position, but you've been talking about it.
Well, I've taken a position. I've laid out 3 principles. So by the way, there are all kinds of other positions, which is neglect. That's a decision. No decision's a decision. That's catastrophic. Neglect is not just bankruptcy potentially for these IOUs, it's liquidation. It is huge increases in electrical costs. There was an article this morning, yesterday, that showed potentially doubling of your electrical bills. We just walk away from this. That is a decision. That's not one that I'm willing to make. But I do want to frame this debate. I want to organize the debate around these 3 principles, and I want to advance that debate with a deep appreciation, the trade-offs, and a recognition that if we're going to meet this moment, everybody has to participate. Everybody. Investors have to participate. Insurers have to participate. Attorneys have to participate. Taxpayers, all of us have to row in the same direction. One final point. I also recognize that we also need to meet the victims where they are, and that is to expeditiously move forward with settling these claims, because everything I just said is predicated on that. Until we do that, it's difficult to then assess what's the appropriate level of contribution that needs to be made by the utilities. And so that is, I think, perhaps the most urgent need as we move forward, so that we can then begin to subsequently answer your question.
Can you talk about, as you were just talking about, wanting to get something big done in 90 days, what do you realistically think you could accomplish in 90 days? And then in 2 years, where do you hope to see the PUC and utilities?
Well, we want to reform PUC. We're in the process of advancing a lot of those, and you'll see in the report some of the recommendations. And we're not rolling over that. By the way, a lot of the recommendations we're making in these reports, they're already being actualized, meaning the strike team said you should do this, and I said yes, and we're already beginning the process of moving a lot of things along. As it relates to that issue, again, of fair allocation, this is the big legislative question. And it's going to require legislative consent, concurrence, and this is the area, in these areas I have a lot of executive oversight and capacity, and we're moving aggressively more than any other time in California's history. Combating climate change, those rules and regulations, I'm more proud than anybody. As Plato said, if there's any hope for the world, those were the lanterns. We'll pass them on to others. There was a very bright lantern that was passed on to this administration from previous administrations. This is the issue that requires most of our time and attention in the next few weeks, working with the legislature and key stakeholders. And you know what? This is tough stuff. I mean, this is the sausage it's making. This is hundreds and hundreds of hours. This is weeks and weeks of serious deliberation, compromise, time, analysis. And so I don't know. I can't predict the future, but one thing I can predict, if we don't, again, try to manifest the ideals in this report, that future is not very bright. We're in real trouble right now as it relates to these utilities being vulnerable to bankruptcy and liquidation. This is a serious moment. And as I said, I'll remind you, it's not just about turning on your lights. It's not just about paying your electric bills. It's literally about the economy of this state. It's about our ability to attract business. It's about our environments, the air we breathe. What happened with these wildfires? I'm an environmentalist, but 2.8 million acres burned? I mean, that set us back on our low-carbon green growth goals. Millions and millions of carbon particles were spewing out of those fires, setting us back. I'm committed to the 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. I'm committed to getting those 5 million electric vehicles out on the streets by 2030 and continuing our electrification efforts. You can't do that without stable IOUs. And I will say, in final point on that, just forgive me for being a little more animated. Maybe it's just moving around that does that. PG&E also has to understand that we mean business as well. And their investors need to understand that loudly and clearly. They need to be part of this. That's why I sent that letter about the board. We need the capital. I'm not naive about that. I am, as I've said, a capitalist. But I'm about inclusive capitalism, which means I have the back of ratepayers, taxpayers. I care about my state, care about this country and what this state represents to the world. They have to be part of the solution. And if not, you'll see in the report, all options with PG&E are on the table. All options with PG&E are on the table. If they get in the way of doing the right thing, all options are on the table. Excuse me.
Isn't really a little late for more conversations that we've been dealing with this for at least a year, if not two, and there hasn't been real action on it.
I just got here, sir.
Why not be more aggressive now that you have these, as opposed to more, starting a conversation, taking more of that action at this point?
Let me,
or take positions on which recommendations.
You want me to go back on the presentation? I'll go back to the actions I took by executive order the first day I got into office. Second month I was in office. Third month I've been in office. I haven't even been here 100 days.
How about on this report, though, the actual, your recommendations, or what you want to see done, other than...
So this report lays out recommendations to do more and to continue the progress that we've made. So this report is not just about bullet point number 3. This report has 5 bullet points, and we've been very aggressive. And respectfully, I submit to you, having just served in office for a few weeks, that I was not prepared, and nor have I met anybody that was prepared to answer all of these questions in a few hours, or respectfully, even a few days. And I will put up the sense of urgency and deliberativeness of what we've done in the last 60 days up against any state and any administration. So respectfully, I don't submit to that point of view. I think we are taking this moment seriously, and we are rising to the call. Sir.
Governor, back to the sausage making for a second. When it comes to inverse condemnation, last year the legislature, looked at it and said absolutely no way, smacks of too much of a bailout. What makes you think that things are going to be different now?
I remember that conversation. It was about 20 minutes. I don't remember a lot of the public outreach. I don't remember a lot of public conversations around it. I remember you guys situationally during the holidays, there was some quick conversation. Governor Brown said he wanted to do it, and then, well, he's not doing it. Then there were some private conversations, and that was about it. This is a completely different process of inclusivity. We got some of the nation's leading experts on this. I don't think anyone talked about filing a writ with the Supreme Court or even understanding the nature of the enemy of the commons. I don't recall the enemy of the commons being debated in the legislature. I don't recall any deliberative process of focusing on fault-based reforms. I don't recall any of that. I was there, so I think it's a very different approach. I also think, respectfully, none of us understood the moment we would be in. 9/11 was a different world. Camp Fire, the aftermath of that is just now really coming to light. Woolsey just coming to light. There's a deeper appreciation. I don't know about you, but I wasn't aware of the debris removal costs of camp even a few weeks ago. Those dollars are coming in. The magnitude of this is jaw-dropping. It required the different conditions. I didn't expect, and respectfully on the inverse conversation, I don't know that anyone thought that Southern California Edison and Sempra as the mothership, let alone SDGE, would be one bond rating above junk status today. I don't imagine that we could have even conceived of a board like we have at PG&E today. Investors that said we're not going to participate in any of these funds. So it's a different world completely, and that's why this needs to be on the table.
Governor, you emphatically said that all options are on the table, but to be clear, does that
All
include,
3 options.
does that include a government takeover of Pacific Gas and Electric?
Well, that's what I said is, specific to, well, you'll read the report. You'll look at the report, and there's a word that drives shivers of people's spines. I'll give it to you. It's called municipalization.
On that same point on PG&E, you said earlier you expect them to get serious. You've got a PUC and a federal judge who are practically tearing their hair out because they've fined them more than $1 billion. They're on probation. They've got a monitor. It's not a GPS bracelet. It's a guy named Mark. And none of that has gotten them to take it seriously. What on earth makes you think that there is a chance of them taking seriously without being forced into it? And what are you prepared to force them to do?
Listen, Hans can read his article tomorrow. I mean, I might, but I'm dead serious. I'll repeat what I said. All options are on the table. So if they don't get it, we'll get it done another way.
Are you anticipating setting up a trigger for that?
No, look, hey, it's in their interests at this stage to wake up to the new reality. They got a new team. Let's see, maybe we're wrong. Maybe it's an enlightened board and it's the right board and it's going to meet the moment. Maybe the new president is the right person. He's going to meet the moment. He's, by the way, he's privately said the right things to us. He really did. I mean, it was almost too good. Said all the right things. Maybe you'll follow through on it. Maybe you'll. So got to give these folks a chance. They do the right thing, then this is all going to be made a lot easier. If they don't, all options are on the table. And we have a lot of options. The PUC, as you note, Judge Alsop, my gosh. I mean, if there's anyone, I hope I never get in trouble go in front of Alsop, as you suggest. So, and Alsop's just winding up. He's in the first or second inning. We're just winding up. Picker's just winding up. We come on. This game's not over, and there are a lot of moves, and we want to work with them. We need access to capital. We need stable investment-grade utilities and IOUs. I believe in that. I believe in that for all the reasons that I stated there earlier, and so I'm a little more confident than you.
Should somebody from PG&E go to jail?
Oh, come on. That's above my pay grade at this stage. That's being adjudicated by, let me say this. I just came back from El Salvador. Politicians often determine that. I don't know that that's the best approach to justice. I think the judicial system independently should assess those facts than politicians.
Thinking about the virtuous cycle nature, with all these issues, how do you think the rating agencies are going to receive this report? And do you think that the July 12th deadline is fast enough to stave off a downgrade?
Well, to be determined. I think my personal opinion is the rating agencies should receive this very favorably. We said we were going to do something in 60 days. We did it. The day I took the oath of office, I said I was going to step up our efforts on fire suppression and start holding utilities accountable to reforms, and we're starting to see fruits of that. I'm now specifically stating a deadline that I think is achievable before recess. That's 90 days. We've met all our previous targets. We mean business. I think bringing in Guggenheim and O'Malveny sends a very positive message to the bond rating agencies. I think this approach actually is a good one, because here's the alternative approach. I could do respectfully what others have done in the past, said here's what I want done. I want inverse on my desk, and then it blows up, nothing happens, and then I go, you know what, I'll just wait for the legislature to figure this out. I got to deal with my May revise, or whatever today's crisis is. We're not doing that. We're trying to be on it. It's not, I may have been governor for 90 days, but I've been in this racket for a few decades. I know there's a desire to say, all right, tell me exactly what you want, but that's not how you get things done sometimes. It's the art of what's possible. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking all this noise and then I'm bringing it down and distilling it to its essence. That's what a principle is, the essence. And then I'm organizing around those principles a process that's very deliberative and hopefully refined. And I think that could achieve a real result. Forgive me.
In terms of the changes you're considering for the PUC, does that include changing the leadership?
You do that right in front of Mr. Picker. He, by the way, I just want to applaud the chair. He has been an extraordinary partner in this effort, and has been he's a pro. And I asked him, I said, why did you take this job? What was your thing? He said, voluntold was the, not an easy place to be. And so we have what? No appointments on the PUC right now. I think I made my appointment. I have one. We have one. So there'll be a change with that appointment.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Can I have one more?
Yeah, just to be
You know,
fair.
you were talking about how everybody needs to row together, including taxpayers. Is this kind of a warning that fines or taxes or cuts to other programs are coming?
Well, I don't know, we need much warning, you just need the evidence. Taxpayers are all in. We got skin in the game. Taxpayers, how much of this is being paid by taxpayers already? You're an American citizen. You're paying for FEMA. You're paying for reimbursements. You're paying for debris removal. You're paying for small business loans. We're paying for property tax backfills. We're paying for fire suppression and overtime. It's jaw-dropping. It's not a warning. It's reality. After 2001, when we started securitizing through the Department of Water Resources, the costs associated with the power crisis, ratepayers had to pay. I mean, we're already in this. I could sugarcoat it, and this is where politics and policy, this is, the art of misdirection, I get, is so much easier and no one's held to account. I'm not as good at that, some others, so we gotta own this moment. And as governor, I think it's on me. But I can't do it alone without the legislature, and I'm trying to meet that moment, take responsibility, and try to balance a lot of perspectives. And, change is hard. Dogs don't bark at parked cars. There'll be a lot of barking in the next 90 days.
Just to clarify, Governor, earlier you said that you didn't want to put out, like on inverse, you didn't want to put out some, I don't know if you used the word fiat from the governor's office to do X, you want to get people to get involved in it. The last governor had a proposal in inverse. He said, I want to get rid of inverse. I want to give judges flexibility. Was that the wrong approach?
Oh, come on, I'm looking forward, not back. We have no need for a Brown Newsom conversation.
You have to know where it happened to know where you're going.
That's why I've studied it, and I think the approach I'm taking is self-evident. It's reflected in this report.
Governor, a couple of sausage-making questions. On the procurement part, can you say how that would work a little bit more on how the ISO involved? And it sounded like you were maybe referencing more campfire cleanup costs, or the new numbers there that you can...
Those numbers are constantly, they're approximate, and they keep changing in real time. I won't torture Mark by bringing them up, but the numbers are jaw-dropping.
Can you outline what those are?
I'll get you that. I didn't come prepared to give you our initial estimates, though they are reflected in my budget. As you recall, in the January budget, we estimated the 10% local costs, and we would pick up that delta for communities impacted, as well as backfilling property tax losses. Let me be more precise. My May revise is quite literally a couple weeks away. Those numbers will be updated in the May revise, and you'll be able to compare and contrast. I think that's a better way of giving you that data because it would be more comprehensive in that May revise.
What role do you actively expect to play in landing a legislative deal?
I'm deeply involved in this.
So can you give us a little sense? Will you convene meetings?
Phone calls, meetings, sitting down, organizing, coffee, chairs, tables, days, weekends, nights, afternoons, memos, videos, reports, redacted copies. I mean, I'll be honest, getting in demand management, education.
But just listening, not offering your own.
Guys, this is not just this is listening and offering. I'm deeply leaning in. I'm laying out specific, tangible strategies and breaking down the questions that everybody needs to ask. If you look at the report, it's not 3 pages, it's 60 pages. We ask the tough questions. We assess the risks. If we're going to do a catastrophic wildlife fund, here's what it means to insurers. Here's how that could impact the uninsured, the underinsured. It's a level of nuance, with all due respect, that has been absent in the past, and we're presenting all of that, and we're creating the conditions for possibility to promote not just pablum and promises, to promote policy solutions. Where we land is a collaborative process. Unlike the President of the United States, I'm not a dictator. Unlike the President of the United States, I'm aware of the nature of the 3 branches of government. And why I say 3? Because you can't have an inverse condemnation nation conversation without the California Supreme Court, conceivably the U.S. Supreme Court. You cannot have a conversation around setting up funds by executive fiat. You need the PUC's consent. You need the consent of the governed, taxpayers. It's an inclusive process. So I came here to get something done and hold me to account on what we accomplish. Please remind yourselves, this is not my second term, my last month in office. This is, I mean, quite literally just a few weeks into an administration. I hope, good people can disagree, and I respect if you do. I hope people understand how seriously we're taking this, and I think it's been so far well received by most legislator leaders, and I'm very grateful for that, and I think a lot of the stakeholders as well, but I will find out when you call them and they update their thinking on this topic. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you, guys.